Welcome. Let's start after lunch. Let me welcome you to the next session called User Data Sharing Incentives and Trust. We are very happy to have two researchers here, Glen Weyl and Ari Waldman. Let me briefly say a few words about them before I give them the floor. Ari is a legal scholar. He is an associate professor of law at New York Law School and the director of the Innovation Center of Law and Technology there. He has written a book that has just appeared this year, which is called Privacy as Trust, Information Law for an Information Age. So I think this makes him fit perfectly to the topic of this conference. So we are very glad that he's here. And we have Glen Weyl. Some of you, actually, how do you pronounce your last name?
Weyl.
Weyl, like the German. Okay, so I made an effort to pronounce it differently, and that was wrong.
It's a German name.
I know, but I thought, you know, who knows? Okay, Glen is a principal researcher at Microsoft Research. Some of you might have seen him yesterday already. He introduced his book here. So if you are interested in some of his work that he's probably not talking about today, then take a look at this. He has worked and is working on a number of issues. He started out, I guess, doing mechanism design, I/O, but he has done many other things. So he's working on voting and market design. And today, again, he's going to talk about data and privacy and issues related to that. But now I want to hand over to Ari. Thank you.
Great. Oh, Jesus. Thank you. Can't take me anywhere. Thanks. Oh, sure. Sit wherever. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me to talk at this conference. It's a real pleasure, not just because I wrote a book about privacy and trust, to be able to speak at a trust conference, but also to be able to come to Berlin, where people take privacy a whole lot more seriously than people back in the States, where we are more often lawless savages when it comes to our privacy. Today, I want to talk a little bit about privacy, the connection between privacy, trust, and design. This is my book on Privacy as Trust was about the direct themes of this conference: why we share information, how companies manipulate us into sharing, or what are the incentive structures behind our sharing behavior online. And my second big book project is going to be relating that to questions of privacy by design. This is a really interesting connection here. So first, I want to start by saying that design, this question of design, which we talked a little bit about in the first panel, is everywhere. And it's everywhere in our daily lives. Everything from architectural choices that direct where you go down a street to our online experiences. So all of the choices that we make, disclosing a piece of information, liking a post on Facebook, all of the choices that we make are in some ways influenced by the design choices that are made for us by engineers and other technologists employed by mostly large technology companies. In the United States, and to a certain extent still at the heart of privacy law and policy, even in Europe, is this concept of notice and choice. The GDPR has advanced or developed privacy law far further, but still at its core, consent and transparency about data use practices are at the core of privacy law, and it's especially true in the United States. Notice and consent has given us this famous little piece of design. Does everyone know what this is? So this is a design feature of pretty much every Apple product that is out there. You can take out your phones, which I have back at my table. You can take out your phones and see this at every of the nearly 350 points on your phone where you can make choices about your privacy. And of course, this means no or off, and this means yes or on. I think this, and I'm going to argue today that this is the most destructive and manipulative feature of design that anyone has ever come up with. Because what this does is that it makes you feel that you are in control. It gives you the sense that by changing this to this, that you are saying, well, I am taking back control of my data because I am saying no to you, no to tracking, no to geolocation, or no to ad targeting, or what have you. And if you change it from this to this, you are taking control and saying, yes, I want this benefit in exchange for the sharing of my information. But the reason why this is so destructive is because it is a design choice that designers have made in order to make you disclose more. It is added in a context that is created for us to manipulate us into enhancing disclosure. And that's true for several reasons. One is that we are psychologically primed, and there are tons of studies on this. We are psychologically primed to be incapable of evaluating or equating current benefit and balancing those against future risks. So, for example, if I were to offer you some benefit now, a $10 Starbucks gift card, in exchange for the provision of some information that may or may not result in some risk or harm in the future, most of us, I'm not sure about us, but most people, not necessarily highly informed internet users, would accept the current benefit because the future harm or the future risk is way too speculative. So in a world where consent, where your right or your control over consent to tracking or ad targeting is the be-all and end-all of privacy law and policy, this is priming you to accept current benefits over future harms. And we see these kind of design choices that companies make for us to manipulate us into disclosure all over the place. This is Snapchat. Does anyone use Snapchat? No. Oh, well, great. Europeans, again, Americans are lawless savages when it comes to this. But our friend from the FTC knows this picture very well. This was the first main screen associated with Snapchat, which is an ephemeral messaging service that Facebook that competes with Facebook and Instagram stories and such like that. This is the first screen that you saw, and it required you to toggle anywhere between 5 and 10 seconds, I think, to identify for the app after how many seconds would you want your videos or pictures to disappear. That's what makes it an ephemeral messaging service. This was a total lie. And the FTC knows this very well. The FTC went after Snapchat because the FTC complaint said that despite the fact that this screen existed, despite the fact that if Snapchat made you choose how many seconds after which your picture would disappear, and it promised that there was no way that this picture would continue to exist, that was not true. Snapchat lied in its privacy policy, and even though the FTC does far more in the United States than just broken promises litigation, still a lion's share of its jurisprudence is about companies that say something in their privacy policies and break it. And Snapchat did lie. I would actually go a little further. FTC had an opportunity here to litigate manipulative design under its unfair and deceptive trade practice jurisprudence under Section 5 of the FTC Act. This is manipulative design. This gives you the impression that you are in control of your information, whether it was lying on its privacy policy or not. This manipulates you into thinking this is the perfect platform to send racy and exciting photos that are going to disappear. These pictures were not chosen accidentally. So you can design in tools and platforms and pictures and user interfaces that make us think that this is a trusted environment. This is an environment in which you can share, whether it's a naked selfie or a video that you don't necessarily want on the internet. Uber is another example. Uber designed its platform purposely to continue to track you even after you delete the app. That was a design choice. they specifically said, well, we can do this as long as you agree to our privacy policy. We can install these files onto your phone that will allow us to track it even after you delete it. Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, this is one of the reasons why this lack of law, the fact that this data collection exists in a regulatory void in the United States is exactly why the Cambridge Analytica fiasco happened. When you sign on to Facebook, you agreed to its terms that at the time that this happened allowed for friends' data of people that took the psychological quiz to be shared with third parties through Facebook's API. So in a world where the limits of a technology company's obligations to us are notice and choice, this kind of thing is going to happen all the time. So I want to talk about an alternative. And this is the argument that I made in my book, Privacy as Trust. The basis for law and policy and data collection that we have now is focused on principles of transparency, focused on principles of notice and rational decision making. The idea that transparency is important for trust may be true, but trust is far more. In my book, I define trust as a resource of social capital between or among two or more parties that is based on the expectations that others will continue to behave in expected ways. So, like, for example, in the social, I'm a sociologist, so in the social context, if you give a friend your spare set of keys, you don't know 100% for sure that that person is not going to use those keys and break into your home the next day. But over time, and if you have a background relationship with this person, that they're a friend and that they could be trusted, you know that over time they're not going to abuse their key privileges. You expect that they will behave according to accepted norms, i.e., not breaking into your home with your keys. I took that social concept and said that's how we should think about privacy law, that information disclosed in context of trust should still be considered private. And in the United States, we have a whole lot of problems with our common law courts thinking that any information that is disclosed to at least one other person is no longer private and therefore not protected by any kind of privacy law. Europe doesn't have that kind of extensive, again, lawless problem, but that gives us a significant change. If we start thinking about privacy law in that way, that gives us a significant change to how we think about the sharing of data with third parties. We share information in context of trust. And if we recognize that we share information in context of trust, which I think is something that we could all understand, we share just from our own social practice. We share information with our parents, for example, that we might not share with strangers. But we would even share information with strangers that we don't share with our loved ones or our grandparents. The reason why this is also, connected with the principles of design, is the reason why I don't think the privacy paradox really exists. The privacy paradox, as we heard about earlier, is that people seem to care about privacy when you ask them. But when they go online, or when you give them an interface or an opportunity to give over personal information in exchange for some benefit, they freely give over their information. The reason why the privacy paradox actually exists is because of design, is because companies manipulate us. They manipulate our choices by creating an online environment that facilitates disclosure through trust. That is what Facebook does. Facebook created a platform that is all about trust. Everyone's called a friend. Everyone has a little picture next to it, next to him or her. You see everyone's interaction above and below a post or a picture. It makes you feel, it gives you this false sense that instead of interacting with a multi-gazillion-dollar company that is using your data to enrich itself, that all you're really doing is just talking to your friends on the stoop in front of your building. So they make design choices, whether it's whom you see, what you see, when you see it, that make you think that this is a trusted environment, even though it's not. So trust and companies' ability to design in false senses of trust is the reason why the privacy paradox exists, in my opinion. It's the reason why Cambridge Analytica, and the fact that we don't translate that trust concept into law is the reason why Cambridge Analytica could happen in the first place. So what does it mean to translate trust concepts into law? Well, how can we design for privacy and trust? We can't do that. We can't think that companies are going to do that on their own. Sometimes privacy and privacy by design is orthogonal to their basic business interests. The FTC knows this super well. So we need law. We need law to regulate companies and to force or incentivize companies to take privacy seriously. One way to do that is we need to stop fetishizing consent. And this is where I think that the GDPR doesn't go far enough. At its core, the GDPR is a consent-based regime. It's an opt-in regime, but it's a consent-based, that nothing will happen with your data unless you consent. But companies manipulate us into consenting even when we don't want to, through design choices. So we need to stop creating privacy law based on a principle of consent, which I don't think is effective at all. We are simply psychologically and sociologically incapable of giving free and voluntary consent. Exactly. How else should we use law to incentivize designing for privacy and trust? We should treat data collectors not as companies to whom we consent to use our information, but as fiduciaries of our information. And this is a common law concept in England and the United States. The idea that that we entrust to companies our information, and therefore they have a responsibility to us not to con us out of the benefits of that data. If we treat companies like Facebook, like Google, as information fiduciaries, as people who are allowed to use our data to a certain extent to create a platform, but not to lull us into a false sense of security and then hurt us in the end, which is what Facebook has been doing for the last several years with its poor security and lax concern for privacy, then we could go after them. Individuals could sue them, as well as, at least in the United States, the FTC, and in Europe, if we thought about this in a similar statutory context, data protection authorities. When it comes to privacy by design, in order to get privacy baked into the core of of products, as well as companies that are creating, the data collectors and companies that are creating our products, we need to have more than just engineers in design meetings. This is something that I'm working on for my next book about how engineers really don't have the same perceptions about privacy that lawyers or that most people in Europe do. We need lawyers involved in the design process. We need lawyers who are more capable of spotting the privacy issues in the design process. And in the Q&A session, I can talk about a whole ton of examples about how this would help. And we need to create an ethos among designers that privacy is important by educating them better, by giving them privacy education while they're in engineering school. So the final thing I'll mention before turning it over to our next speaker is, the last question is, does the GDPR, which many say is a new tool is going to integrate trust into the privacy system, does that actually do so? Well, Article 25 is about privacy by design, which is really what we've been talking about here. And this is what it says. I know this is a lot of words. This is Section 1 of Article 25 of the GDPR. There is a Section 2, which is by default, but let's put that off to the side. This is Section 1 of Article 25, and it has a lot of prefatory phrases. It has a lot of examples, such as it has a lot of stuff. So let's break it down into the real words, the real core of what Article 25 data protection by design requires. Right now, I should have put the next picture, the next slide is this. What I really should have done is that emoji that goes like this with its shoulders up. Right, yeah, I should just have you consent to this, right? So this is Article 25, Section 1. The controller shall implement appropriate technical and organizational measures which are designed to implement data protection principles in an effective manner. That is, and this is a new paper that I have coming out shortly, a short essay coming out shortly, that is nothing. I have no idea what that is other than you should implement the GDPR. You should implement the rest of the GDPR. It's like some kind of catch-all sentence that has no real meaning whatsoever. It doesn't talk about trust. Trust is not one of the implement data protection principles, which, by the way, are pretty much kind of fair information practice principles plus, a little bit more than traditional principles. So I'm not sure what this is other than a catch-all, and it's not implementing the kind of trust-based, fiduciary-based, expectations-based requirements that we want. What I want to see data protection authorities in Europe and the FTC in the United States going after or policing companies who engage in manipulative design, in companies that use design to create environments that lull us into a false sense of trust, but instead lie to us and make us create environments that encourage us to disclose information even when we don't want to. Thanks.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ari. The next speaker is Glen. I propose we just continue and then we start with the discussion.
So in that spirit, I just wanted to say that there were so many areas of really interesting overlap between what Ari said and the things that I'm going to be saying. And I think it should be a super fruitful discussion, and I'm sort of going to be tempted to like interject relationships into it. But I'm going to try not to do that and just give my standard spiel about this, and then hopefully afterwards we can have the discussion. So if a million things pop into your head being like, well, didn't Ari just say that? I agree. And hopefully we can talk about that soon. Okay, so this paper is joint work with 3 interns that I had at Microsoft, Imanol Arrieta Ibarra, Diego Jimenez Hernandez, and Leonard Goff, along with my longtime collaborator and friend at Microsoft, Jaron Lanier, who, if you guys haven't encountered him, you should really look him up. He's a fascinating individual, and his official title at Microsoft is now the Microsoft Octopus.
German prize.
I do know that very well, yes. So I assume many people
Germans
here
like
would be.
him.
So he's the Office of the Chief Technology Officer, Prime Unifying Scientist, or Octopus. Okay, so the basic idea of this project is, as you all know, there's a lot of discussion about the data economy. I won't get into that more. There's lots of benefits that it obviously brings. People get a lot of value, consumer surplus, out of digital services. But it's based on a very particular compact between the user and the service provider, which is basically one that I would describe as sort of quasi-feudal. It's sort of a relationship where all the marketable value of the things produced by users are claimed by some sort of capital owner. And on the other hand, users in exchange for this are allowed to do various things which may or may not be exactly what they'd want to do with the marketable value of the things that they produce, but are, you know, thought to be nice services. And maybe it's even a quite good deal that they're getting. I mean, maybe they're getting great services or not, but it has very little to do with the actual value of the things that they're producing. It's this sort of, you get free stuff and you give us for free your data. And in some ways that's a really good deal, but it's also, I think, coming to seem to many people increasingly problematic for a variety of reasons. I mean, we've seen a big backlash against this. The Economist, our friend Ludwig, who has now left us, but he's written a whole series of cover stories about the problematic nature of this economy. We've seen Congress get upset. We've seen Angela Merkel get upset. And if you haven't seen it, you should really check out this wonderful video that Google put out. How many people in this room have seen the Selfish Ledger video? Well, so not enough people. Everyone should watch this, actually, because it's quite an inspiring vision of the perspective that this tends to lead to, that basically suggests the idea that, does anyone know the idea of the selfish gene? So it's the idea that, like, you know, it's actually genes that evolve and organisms are just carriers for this. Well, in the same way, this suggests that, like, people are not the clients of Google, that Google's clients are actually the data, and that people are sort of carriers of the data, and that, in fact, if there's a piece of data that Google wants that you're not giving to Google, rather than say ask you for that data. It should use what it knows about you to design a tracker into some device that you will then be sort of induced to want to purchase, and then it will have the relevant data that it needs. Beyond sort of just the creepiness and weirdness of all this, I want to try to put some economic terms on what I think people find worrying about this. So there's increasing worries that in the future of AI, there's going to be an issue of joblessness and so forth. And I think a lot of economists tend to sort of dismiss that a little bit, because they say, well, look, if some jobs go away, it's not like people are going to do nothing. They'll find some other jobs, and I think that's right. But I think the bigger issue is that we've seen a dramatic fall in the share of national income being allocated to labor. That's been true throughout the world during this period. For example, in the United States, it's fallen by about 10%, the share of income going to labor. And the tech sector seems to be playing some role in this. So if you look at the the labor share of the largest tech companies, the New York Times actually did a really interesting study on this recently. Facebook's about 5%, Google's about 10%, Microsoft's about 15, 20%, depending on how you look at it. Amazon's actually the best. I think it's like 30, 35%, something like that. But these really data-heavy companies are giving almost none of the rents that come out of this to labor. Almost all of it's going to capital. And sort of regardless of whether that literally leads to unemployment or whether it just leads to incredibly low wages, I don't think that's really the key point. The key point is that the pie is being shifted in these AI-intensive areas increasingly towards the owners of capital. And at the same time, I'm not sure that this free-for-free relationship is really leading to a particularly productive data economy either. We're increasingly being sort of manipulated into giving productive information to these companies without being compensated, rather than being directly asked for it. So this is a reCAPTCHA where you're being asked, allegedly, in order to make sure that the site is secure for your protection, to give information that's then being used to train text recognition algorithms by Google. And in fact, Luis von Ahn, who invented this, I was going around giving talks like this for quite a while, and someone came up to me and said, I heard almost exactly the same talk from Luis von Ahn, who invented a lot of the systems that you're describing. He's so disturbed by the way in which people are being manipulated by these systems to give free labor to these companies that he's actually, saying the same thing that you're saying. So I think an XKCD commercial cartoon captured this really nicely. So this says, to complete your registration, please tell us whether or not this image contains a stop sign. Answer quickly, are self-driving cars approaching the intersection? And it says, so much of AI is just figuring out ways to offload work onto random strangers. And then if you sort of hover over this, its little subtext is, crowdsourced driving is less appealing than is a self-driving car. I think even beyond these, inequality and, issues with productivity, are we even really getting good data out of this? Or because we're just manipulating people, are we actually getting sort of low quality, not such good responses because we're not compensating people? But beyond this, I just think this is overall giving people a feeling of being really sort of alienated from the digital economy, not having a stake in it, giving the feeling of coastal elites getting all the rents and dominating everything, and leaving us all, the rest of us, in the positions of being sort of like passive and sort of disrespected consumers rather than active participants in creating this economy. And an analogy I like to make is, imagine that when the film industry first got set up, rather than us having movie stars and, Screen Actors Guilds protecting them and people getting credits and whatever, imagine someone just went out with their video camera and started recording people doing interesting things on the street, and then, sold that as movies. You can think of all the problems that would have. Like, all the rents would go to the people who own the movies, or, maybe a few directors and so forth. And, you wouldn't actually have very good movies, because you just get whatever people happen to be doing on the street, rather than people being able to develop careers and, actually become expert in being film stars. And people would have this, really kind of completely unreal sense that somehow, the camera was replacing human beings. in theaters, when in fact it wasn't the camera, it's just that you were taking the acting work of all the people on the street without compensating for them for it or making them aware of it. So what we argue in this work is that we need to really shift the paradigm here from one of thinking of data as capital to be collected by a small number of platforms to labor. And I want to give a bunch of concrete contrasts between how these two paradigms line up in my perspective. So in the data as capital perspective, data is exhaust that's just thrown off by people as they do things, that is there to be picked up by whoever's smart enough to make use of it. Whereas in the data as labor perspective, we say, no, data is actually created either actively by things that we're doing, or even when it's passive, it's really a result of the people that we are and the people that we choose to become and the human capital that we all have. So if we're compensated for that, we'll have more incentive to actually create data that's particularly valuable to these companies, and that'll make AI more productive. Data's capital perspective says that AI's success is mostly driven by algorithms, computational power, and brilliant programmers. This you might call the Peter Thiel sort of perspective on what drives the success of AI. Whereas in the data's labor perspective, AI is actually just another name for the collective intelligence of human beings and will flourish if those human beings know what they're doing and have a stake in economically in that production. The data's capital perspective says that AI is going to therefore flourish if you get big payoffs to entrepreneurs and innovators, another sort of Peter Thiel point. But data as labor says, no, AI will flourish if the individual contributors who make it possible have an economic stake directly in the value that they end up creating on the margin. Data as capital perspective says that, we should expect AI to displace workers. And so either those workers are going to have to find work in other areas, or we're going to have to sort of give those now useless people a universal basic income and maybe some marijuana to buy with it. And they will, hopefully then not disturb the genuinely productive members of society who are creating all this other stuff. And the data's labor perspective said, no, AI is just one more production technology which takes the work of ordinary people as an input and combines it with capital to produce some output. And really, it just offers one more opportunity for people to amplify the value of their labor, the same way that the factory amplified the value of people's labor, the same way that the film production amplified the value of actors. The data's capital perspective says that as a result of this displacement, people are going to have to find meaning in other parts of their lives and learn to get over themselves, that there have to be like some productive member of society. Whereas the data's labor perspective says, no, the value of data will actually support a sense of meaning and digital dignity in people's lives, that they will take pride in the fact that Google, assistant is not just something that was invented by Sergey Brin that somehow magically is now speaking in human voices, but that actually that's a mashup of all of the conversations that they've been listening to us have in recent years. And sixth, the data's capital perspective says individuals are happy to consent to surveillance in exchange for getting cool free stuff, and so companies deserve to use their data. Whereas the data's labor perspective says, no, individuals have very little bargaining power and very little understanding, as Ari was saying, of what they're agreeing to, or even if they understood it, they would have very little ability to negotiate when it's basically a monopsony over purchase of their data, and that's the only way that they can access critical services for them. And therefore, they just really don't have any power to negotiate. And in fact, you need, like labor has always needed, collective organization and fiduciaries like governments, like labor unions, to bargain on their behalf for fair terms of work, privacy, fair, terms and conditions, fair limits on work, privacy, and fair compensation, wages for that data work. Okay. So how did we end up in the current equilibrium if it's so inequitable and inefficient? Well, usually when you run into things like this, the old liberal problem is a combination of what I would call prejudice, which is people getting used to a particular way of doing things and not really thinking through the consequences of that, and the privileges that those prejudices establish and then try to reinforce that underlying prejudice. So, the internet business model really grew out of sort of the Silicon Valley grew out of really sort of the hippie movement, which had this notion that information wants to be free and, we should all just, give away everything and so forth, which was, had some positive to it. But what it ended up doing is it ended up devaluing human work and saying that stuff should all be free. But capital is still scarce, and the computers are still scarce. And entrepreneurial talent is still to be venerated. And so we had this thing where we sort of like up-weighted the value of capital in entrepreneurship, and we down-weighted and sort of eliminated and marginalized the value of human contributions. And that ended up being, it turns out, really valuable to certain capitalists who then exploited and reinforced that ethos of, everything should be free to their advantage. And as a result, they got an incredible amount of network and monopsony power. In fact, there's been a really nice study done recently by Arin Dubé and his colleagues, which shows that even a typical requester on mTurk, put aside big players like Facebook and Google where you really have no alternative, their residual labor supply elasticity that they face for randomizing their prices is about 0.15. That's the residual labor supply elasticity faced by a typical requester on mTurk. And then you think, what's the labor supply elasticity faced by these other guys? That would lead to an underpricing of data by 1 to 2 orders of magnitude relative to the actual marginal revenue product that it's generating. So you can immediately think of the inefficiency that that's creating. So to try to deal with this issue, I really think that there are 3 sources of power that can countervail against these monopsonies. One is competition, because there are some tech companies, some big tech companies, whose business model is less oriented to the strip mining of individual data. That's central for Facebook and Google and for part of Microsoft. But a lot of Microsoft, for example, is actually a productivity company. And if people come to view themselves more as workers and producers online rather than as consumers, that could really be important. That could really offer a different opportunity. And by the way, Amazon and Apple also have a very different business model. And given that they have a very different business model, they might also potentially be open to a world in which people come to view themselves more as producers to be protected by those companies rather than as consumers to just enjoy the things that they throw off. Second, and I think very importantly, we need fiduciaries. And one thing where maybe I differ a little bit from Ari is I don't trust that those companies, those large companies, can actually be those fiduciaries. I actually think that it's sort of hopelessly compromised to put together a services layer with that. I want dedicated fiduciaries who are nonprofits, who are independent, and whose sole responsibility is to be accountable for that fiduciary role. And I think that that's what a data labor union could do. And in fact, the first of these was established 2 weeks ago in the Netherlands by a Dutch socialist member of the European Parliament. And third, we need to support, just as with the normal labor movement, we need labor law to support these labor unions. We need to give them the protections that are associated with that fiduciary role and the ability to compel participation in some cases that are associated with that fiduciary role, as well as a means towards it, the sort of portability through GDPR that we've been talking about. And recently I mentioned that this labor union was established, data protection regulations came in Europe, and Chancellor Merkel has been talking about the idea of putting a price on data in some form. Now, that was usually interpreted as a data tax, but I actually viewed her more as saying, no, we actually have to channel the benefits to the people who are actually creating these benefits, and to have German data workers and European data workers providing all these inputs, but then all the rents go to American capitalists is not really a sustainable thing from either a foreign policy or a social justice perspective. So this idea is part of a broader book project that Eric Posner and I have, which really tries to argue that markets, properly conceived, can actually be sort of a liberatory egalitarian force, that actually paying people for that data and building a more symmetric marketplace and really creating, rather than this fiction of everything is free except all the rents that are received by these large capitalists, that can actually even out the playing field if we revalue labor and if we try to create more of an actual competitive market for data. And that's one of actually probably the smallest of the ideas in this broader book project that we have. But more broadly, we're just thinking about ways in which we can actually use markets as a transformative solution to social problems. And if any of you are interested in that, I'd encourage you to pick up a free copy of the book that's out there. And if anyone wants me to sign them as well, I'm happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was great. Love that.
Yeah, I think so. No, I love yours.
Great. Thank you very
Such a
much,
great
Ari and Glenn. Let me start out by asking one question to each of you, and then, of course, I also allow you to comment, but then I open up the discussion for everyone, so be prepared. And the same rule as before applies, so all the women think of questions now. Ari, I have one, thanks a lot for your presentation. I have one comment, and I think it really fitted nicely with what Stacy said, that people develop trust into Facebook because, you know, things look nice, and you talked a lot about design, so I think that makes a lot of sense. But I was a little bit wondering, you know, why you trust lawyers to do a better job in doing the I would call it nudging. I mean, what these firms do is basically framing the stuff such that that things look cute and trustworthy. Economists always think economists should do the job, or psychologists think that psychologists should do it, because there's, of course, a lot of psychology in it that we should admit here on the panel, where there's no psychologist. I'm wondering how you said the engineers should be trained to do that. I mean, if they work for firms that have certain interests, why should the engineers, even if they have the training, do something that is against the interests of the companies? That seemed a little bit naive to me, to put it in this way.
Well, privacy should not be against the interests of the company. Yeah. And period.
Okay, but that means more than the design. That means regulatory constraints.
Absolutely, it means regulatory constraints. Okay. Design is just one of them. And Europe has, and Germany, even before, Germany is at the heart of this, has made a choice that there are certain things that are just as a normative matter. We don't want companies as a normative and a value matter, that companies can do X with data, but we don't want you to do that, and we don't think that is in keeping with European values. So to suggest that a company should be allowed to tell its engineers to do whatever they want or whatever they can is a uniquely kind of conservative American approach, or very Silicon Valley approach to these things. Very Peter Thiel, for example, right? But I think the broader point that I was trying to make is that why lawyers and why not psychologists or whomever, that's less of the concern as who is the other person. I say lawyers because lawyers have a tendency to at least be more capable than engineers of spotting the privacy issues as they come up during design. The psychologists is the ones that the psychologists and the statisticians to date are the ones that the company hire in order to manipulate us better. The lawyer is the one that we need to empower to put on the brakes, which is the traditional role. But the lawyers
write these long sentences that you quoted, right? That
That's
nobody
right.
understands.
So lawyers write those too, because too many lawyers are also trained in this idea that privacy is just notice and consent. So the follow-up project to Privacy is Trust is based on a series of interviews with engineers and lawyers who work at major technology companies to find out, well, how do they actually do the work of design on the ground? And there's a book out there which has kind of set the tone for this discussion so far, that gives a lot of credit to chief privacy officers in setting the tone and saying chief privacy officers talk about privacy in terms of trust, and they are integrating privacy into design. And my perspective is, well, CPOs don't design anything. The people who do the designing are the engineers on the ground. And In interviewing them, I found that their perspective on privacy was far different than what a CPO might think or what a lawyer might think. But in talking to the lawyers in those companies, they decline to get involved in any way in the design process because they say, well, that's not what I do. I'm just the lawyer, I write contracts, I do this, I do that, I don't want to get involved. And that's the wrong way to think about it. We need privacy and ethics to be at the core of what these companies think about, and the only way to do that is through more extensive regulatory intervention.
Thanks. So then comes my second question now to Glen. I really like your idea of thinking about data labor unions, and because it makes you think of all these historical parallels of what labor unions do, and I think it raises a number of interesting questions. So there is a collective action problem. I think that's clear, right? That's why you need unions for workers, but in your case for data. But it also raises questions, of course, as to how hopeful we can be that there's something is going to happen along these lines. I mean, the unions in the US are even weaker than the ones in Europe and have been going down, the real ones, the worker unions. And the problem, it seems, is that you need a certain type of awareness of workers, and in our case, consumers, to know that they have to fight for their own rights. Now, if you look at, I'm an experimental economist, I've done a lot of experiments on privacy choices. If you look at awareness of consumers, and we all, there are lots of examples of that, I'm not so optimistic that, that something like this will happen, that they will organize their interests in such a way. So that makes me a little bit skeptical. That's my first question. And the second question is, you said markets help. You framed it as part of the book, which has this main theme. But, we have markets and they work fine, right? So, I just wonder about this, how malleable is this interpretation as making markets. I work in market design, and I think it matters a lot how you design the markets, but I don't like to say, I think it's a little bit superficial to say markets will solve it, because it really matters how you do it. So I'm a little bit skeptical of these, but that's more of a packaging thing maybe than in...
So those are great questions. So first of all, in terms of the labor movement, the way I think about things is, look, we have to have design innovation in social institutions that keeps up with design innovation in technology. And I think the fundamental problem has been that, look, the labor movement did great things, but the labor movement was fundamentally premised on the notion of sort of white guys in their 40s hammering on stuff. And our society has moved beyond that in a whole bunch of different ways. And the labor movement should have moved beyond that too, and should have designed new structures that were adapted to those new situations, rather than saying either we hold on to this old, outmoded, and ultimately extremely exclusionary notion of what labor is, or we allow monopsonies to completely run all over us at every opportunity. Both of those are just not the right idea, nor in antitrust should we be the antitrust issue is electrical utilities. Let's just keep lots of regulation on electrical utilities. That's just not the central power dynamic of the present. But that doesn't mean we should just give up on activist antitrust policy. We have to adapt it, and we have to be as innovative as the companies are being. And so I think we need a data labor union, because that is the relevant issue of today. And I agree, the consciousness is not so great out there, but that can develop symbiotically with the concepts. And in fact, that's exactly what happened in the labor movement of the 19th century. Labor unions developed together with ideas like Karl Marx and others who built a concept of what is class consciousness and identity. And I think that that's happening. That's why this data labor union got established. That's why this stuff has gotten such interest in the press and so forth. And in terms of markets, so on the substantive question of do we have markets already, and my answer would be no. The idea that a monopoly is a market is a contradiction in terms. Look, exactly what the idea that just letting, quote, the private sector, unquote, be free is a solution to any problem is ridiculous. If you look at Adam Smith, what he was upset about was not government taxes in the modern sense. They were the East India Company and the ways in which it restricted trade and used that to raise taxes. That was just one monopoly. And it's always been the goal of liberalism to fight against monopolies. And anyone who interprets Adam Smith or Jeremy Bentham as some sort of like conservative force fighting for monopolies, you know, as long as they're, quote, private, unquote, that's nonsense. I mean, that's just never been what the liberal movement was about. That's not what John Stuart Mill was about, et cetera. And why do I think that's important as packaging? Because the rhetoric of free markets is the #1 thing used by the wealthy and powerful to defend their entrenched privileges in our society. And if we don't take that away from them, if we don't reclaim that rhetoric from them, we will come off as just another reinvention of state socialist crap that no one is going to accept in Western societies. So we have to reclaim that rhetorical tool from them, and we have every right to, because they're the ones who are abusing it.
Great, thanks. So it's interesting. That's actually. I think in Europe it's easier to talk about state socialism. So I think so we have a different we need different arguments in different countries maybe, but who knows? But thanks a lot. So but you said, so I don't want to cut short the discussion here. I don't know if you have any comments to each other. Then
one thing I wanted to say, which I really loved about what Ari said, was this idea that we are manipulated into trusting. And that the whole frame puts us there, I think is really critical, and I think that's like very much what I'm trying to like undermine, because I actually think this labor framing of it, a lot of people feel uncomfortable with that, but that's exactly what I like about it. Because the thing is, it puts you in this frame of being like, no, I should be on guard to protect my economic interests and other interests in every stage of this process. If I come to think of myself as a producer and not just a consumer, then I'm not put in this frame of just being like, oh, they're just going to be serving me. If you know, so. Right,
which is classic Marx. I mean, Marx said that consumption is production, and that led to, I think that is integral to the proposal, to the ideas that you're talking about. So let's put that in a practical context of new technology. So one of the things that I write about are social robots. So I don't write about robots like robots of war and robots in industry, but I'm a sociologist, so I write about social robots. And a social robot is, you may have seen them on TV, or you may have actually used it. It's anything from, it's like when it's like a robot that engages with us on a social or emotional level. So there are social robots that look like really adorable baby seals. And if anyone doesn't know what a baby seal looks like, if you have a computer in front of you, Google image of baby seal, and there'll be a collective, oh, they're so cute. There are social robots that look like baby seals that are operating in elderly homes, as well as in childcare or kindergartens, to create companionship, but also to support students in interaction. Like if you are on the spectrum or have autism, engaging with a social robot that is trained based on large data sets and your interactions with it to interact with you on a social level is really kind of awesome. But social robots are primed to manipulate us into thinking that this is a safe, trusted space. Because, oh my God, it's an adorable baby seal. They don't know that there is a large, extraordinarily predatory data collector behind the interface, and there is no privacy policy. You're looking at a baby seal. You're not looking at a website where someone can bury a privacy policy in the bottom right-hand corner, or there's no cookie notification that comes up. So social robots are a perfect example of something that of design choices that lull us into false senses of trust to encourage disclosure. Now, if we had a model that you're talking about of a data labor union, how might users who are confronted with an interface like that so obviously lulls us into false senses of trust and makes us feel like we are just pawns in this production scheme, how could that empower users of those kind of manipulative products?
Well, I think that a data labor union would create an interface in terms of the framing of the interaction that would cause at critical decision points, people to view things in this sort of adversarial financial way, that they need to be thinking about it. You know, I read a recent book by Viviana Zelizer, which I recommend to everyone, called The Purchase of Intimacy, which is all about sort of how money does and does not corrupt intimate relations. And she gives this great example that, like, even within the context of prostitution, when it's regulated, it's totally viewed as inappropriate that, like, in the heat of sex or something like that, the prostitute then asks something of you, right? Because the whole point is that there's an interface there that is set up in such a way that you say, here's the adversarial commercial part of the relationship, and here's the part of the relationship that's governed by a different principle. And that, I think it's precisely like the mixing of those things that's so inappropriate in that baby seal part of the relationship. And the data labor union can precisely manage that, because it can say, okay, look, I'm signing up, I'm aware of the fact that I'm a laborer, I'm doing whatever, but then in many of my interactions, and I can set, say dials that might say, look, I care a ton about privacy, I really don't want to be monitored at all. Other people might say, look, I want to be compensated a little bit more. Let me, when I'm thinking in that frame of financial trade-offs, do that. And then when I'm going on Facebook and just being social, it can feel to me like I'm just doing the normal thing. And maybe occasionally there will be a pop-up asking me to, like, add something to Facebook to help them, so at least it's transparent. But I've sort of separated things out in the way that we do in our lives into the financial frame in the moments when I'm really going to focus on that, and into this more fluid social frame in the moments when that's really, like, the appropriate thing.
That's great. And what you're talking about are design choices that integrate more friction into that falsely created social environment, which I think is perfectly right.
Great. Now I have the first question from the floor. Michael Border. Oh, yeah, right.
No, I have.
Okay,
no.
I already talked, so it's fine.
The woman said yes. So I have a question. I'm fascinated by this idea. I do labor and macro. Okay, I'm very interested in trying to explain the downward trend in shares as well. There's a guy out there who's been pushing the right to be represented by a bot. I find Dorothea's question absolutely compelling. It's very hard to organize the entire world to represent for the micro value that you're talking about.
You're talking about Albert Wenger?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So would this not be an alternative to a classic labor union? Everyone gets a chance to send a bot into space and to sample Expedia and all the other websites and pretend like they're other people and try to find it the best price. Because otherwise we're getting exploited, third-degree price discrimination anyway on every website that we visit. And also the data thing, I think, is fantastic. It's absolutely right. So what's stopping us from getting represented by a bot?
So first of all, I actually really do like the idea of representation by bots. I don't think it's either necessary or sufficient for the things I'm trying to deal with the data labor union, but I do think it's a great complement to it. The reason I don't think it's necessary is I do think that effectively a data labor union can have lots of technical experts involved in it and level out the asymmetry of information without necessarily having to be a bot per se, even though a bot might be part of its architecture. And I don't think it's sufficient because I think there is a fundamental monopsony problem here, which you just can't overcome by just being smart. I don't care how, with all due respect to what Ari's saying, I don't care how friction or whatever you put in there without some real regulation and power on the other side. And I think Ari would agree. There's no way to solve the fundamental problem that Facebook is the social network. And even if I knew everything they were doing, it would be pretty hard for me to say no to their terms and conditions if that's all I'm confronted with is a take it or leave it offer. In the same way that workers, no matter how smart they were, under 19th century capitalism, didn't have the bargaining power to say, no, I'm just going to have my family go starve because I don't like the conditions in this factory, right? So I don't think it's enough. But I agree. I think that's a great idea. And actually, my ideal eventual version of a data labor union would be some sort of eventual blockchain-based solution where you wouldn't have such centralized power in a potentially exploitative union. There would be some set of protocols that would handle it. I don't think we're anywhere near being ready to do that at this point. But I think that that's something to hope to work towards.
Sveta.
Okay, so I fully agree with what you are saying, but now I am just wondering, is it only the story that we have just to have a look on the firms? So what about the victims, the consumers? Isn't it better to start already with the kids and teach them about the value? What is the value of the data? When I see my son, so for him data is nothing. So it's something that he can trade without any thinking about this. Maybe then it will be more helpful knowing the value of the own data to create later, to develop this consciousness of data union.
So I totally agree, but I actually am not as pessimistic as you are about kids. Actually, one thing I found is that when I talk to people under the age of 18 about this, it's like so obvious and intuitive to them because they're constantly in online worlds, trading things and building things for other people and whatever. So the idea that the digital artifacts that they build are some separate, necessarily free thing that they should just give away is pretty alien to them. Whereas to older people, there's like this weird, different digital world, and some of that's totally different than the physical world that I'm living in. So I actually have a lot of hope that as young people grow up, just the things they've been exposed to and their sort of nativeness to this world will make it like much more obvious to them that this is going on. A great example of this is, has anyone read Ready Player One? The novel? Anyways, the big movie about it. They made a movie out of it. But there's a very famous scene in there where basically some guy is in virtual reality like playing some game, but it's actually building something in virtual reality for someone else, and they come to realize this and that they're all being exploited, and they sort of like form like a slave revolt within this digital world. So it's actually like quite palpable, I think, to a lot of younger people that that's what's going on.
And there are a lot of Pew Research Center surveys that show that younger people, quite contrary to our stereotype of them, are far savvier than even people my age, I'm in my late 30s, and older are when it comes to sharing information.
Yeah.
Stacy, and then Steve.
So this is a really fascinating discussion. My question really goes to sort of, Ari, a little bit of what you were talking about, privacy by design, because as you mentioned, that's something that the FTC and the EC both advocate for. And I'm thinking about this in terms of sort of the frictions, right? Because you're talking about introducing a little bit more friction. But we know that consumers really don't like frictions. They ignore them, right? We were talking about people just deleting their GDPR notices. And sort of at the same time, we also know from behavioral economics about a lot of consumer biases. So whether it's overvaluing the president, whether it's overconfidence in their own abilities. And so I'm wondering how you account for those two problems, both frictions, right, which consumers really don't like, and all the stuff we now know about consumers from some of the behavioral work.
I think those are really important questions. In terms of privacy by design, one of the ways that we need to employ the law to better integrate the concept into technology companies is to recognize that companies need to be flexible to make sure companies are flexible with respect to consumer expectations. So to actually respond to consumer expectations. Yes. So the thing that companies do now with design is they respond to their desire to gather data, not consumer expectations with respect to the use of that data. The GDPR integrates privacy principles that are supposed to reflect user expectation as the key as opposed to data gathering as the key. And privacy by design is meant to be structural as well as technological measures that respond to ongoing user expectations. So if companies are flexible within the design process to user biases, to what users actually do respond to and what they don't respond to with respect to implementing an ethos of privacy, that is exactly what we want. I think the point is not that every product that is the result of a privacy by design influenced design process results in a pro-privacy thing. What we want is, because whatever that is, I mean, what is pro-privacy? And people have different desires. What we want is the issues to be discussed and the issues to be raised and spotted, and to provide people with options and to provide people with tools that they need to effectuate their expectations. And right now we're not doing that. So I think that given these biases, design should reflect that these biases exist, and design should provide us with environments as well as options that allow people, that give people far more than just transparency about what's happening because of those biases, but actually reflect those biases in design so as not to result in manipulation.
Well, and I think this idea, just building on what Ari was saying, that consumers like low friction. Well, of course consumers like low friction. Consumers also like low price. Yeah. But the thing is, you can't say that the price is lower than it is. Yeah. That's the real problem. Is like, you know, look, I would really wish, and I think GDPR has singly failed to accomplish this, that when you do one of those boxes, what it says is, a typical use of your data is going to be to release it to the Immigrations and Customs Authority and allow them to track your location. You know, like if that's what's actually going on,
they'd be like, bring on the friction.
That should be the disclosure that happens. Like the disclosure, not, you know, we're going to use this to improve our products. What the hell does that mean? That doesn't mean anything. You should give a genuinely prototypical, sort of weighted by the economic value of the actual uses to the company, description of what it is you're consenting to. And there's absolutely no disclosure that looks like that. If that was the friction that came up, people would feel that that friction was proportioned to the economic weight associated with it. Whereas right now, you put a speed bump for you to consent to something that's so vague and smiley face-y that, of course, it just feels like a stupid friction. Why are they asking me to consent to something that obviously I would consent to? Yeah. But if people actually knew, like, the economic weight of what they are giving away, which the whole setup, in fact, the whole term AI is deliberately meant to undermine that, because it's meant to give you the sense that the technology just pops out of, you know, some computer fully blown, and that your data played no role in actually creating that. And that's just so completely, like the whole setup is totally deceptive. Yeah.
So I think just to add to the friction point, I think that's 100% right. To suggest that people prefer low friction is, I would say, relative to what? You know, so it's not enough to say that users don't want these interferences with the access that you're giving them. Well, one option is to say, well, let them know what the bad things that are happening, and then they'll want the friction. The other thing is to say, well, give them no other option. The law's job is to impose sometimes, or to direct sometimes, the kinds of design or the kinds of platforms or opportunities that we see. When there is zero other option besides the moderate, the little type of friction that we're talking about, so users are either minimally aware or not manipulated, they're going to be fine. So relative to utter anarchy, you know, people love regulation, but relative to, you know, fascism, people might love anarchy. So it's not enough to say that that consumers like friction. Consumers like frictionless exchange, and there are studies on this. So Chris Hufnagel at the UC Berkeley near Silicon Valley did this study about Amazon. I think it's Amazon's Buy Now button, right? Yeah. Amazon has the Buy Now button, and the question was, what would get you to not push on the Buy Now button? And relative to the disclosures that are right below the Buy Now button. So there's Buy Now, and it's in green, and it has a great font, and it's like, and there's confetti around it, and then you get it in a second with a drone, and then of course everyone clicks on it because no friction, and people love no friction. But as soon as you put in red right below it in a really big box that says, if you click on Buy Now, a tornado is going to come and destroy your home, or the data version of that, right? People are going to, that's flippant, of course, but I mean, these were actual real pieces of information about what happens to you and your data when you click on Buy Now. People very quickly, of all shapes and sizes, of all data, of all information knowledge bases, very quickly decide against Buy Now. So we shouldn't. It doesn't matter that consumers prefer low friction, because they're going to prefer whatever they get.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. Of course, I never click on Buy Now.
Right, because we're high information consumers. And also because the design manipulates us to click on it.
Okay. your question.
Thank you for a very provocative session. I do click on buy it now when I know exactly what I want to buy.
The tornado is going to come to your house.
And I know that a tornado is not going to come to my house. And I very much agree and understand the concept of having some regulation to prevent manipulation. And we know people are manipulable and so on. I'm trying to understand better the data union, so to speak. And, you know, I always get a little hesitant when people start citing Karl Marx. You know, I'm not saying that, for me, it's not the Soviet Union that was the proof that this doesn't work. It was actually the failure of the Israeli kibbutzim that was the proof that we have a problem with communal incentives. But going to your point, Glenn, I'm wondering what's different between what happens now, and of course I'm talking more from the retail e-commerce side, not from the Facebook, Google side. Those are markets or engagements that I haven't studied as much. But from the retail or marketplace side, what's the difference between my behavior on the site and a person's behavior in a brick and mortar's Woolworth store 40 years ago, when people would browse around and the clerks would notice, you know, nobody's really trying on that bright green stuff that we brought in last week. Call the people from ordering, tell them, stop bringing that green stuff. My behavior provided valuable information for Woolworths 40 years ago, just like my behavior is providing valuable information for Walmart.com or for Amazon, I think in ways that are commensurate with the social contract of you, Walmart, Amazon, Woolworth, are taking an entrepreneurial risk by bringing stuff into your store and warehouses. My behavior is giving you feedback into how to optimize that risk. In which case, I wouldn't think that getting paid for my behavior is adequate because it's part of the social contract. So I'm wondering how
I think to a first approximation, I basically agree with what you just said, Steve. I mean, my targeting is not really at that sort of use, even though I think that, you know, there are maybe some issues there, but that's not my focus. What would be my focus is imagine that Amazon was taking and using things that you were doing on its website to construct not something that's like relative to the quality of like the services that Amazon's directly delivering that way, but that's training some other artificial intelligence system that's learning sort of the general ways in which people, you know, have preference structures and training some giant machine learning system on that, and then like using that in some very separate context than just like optimizing the availability or recommendations on Amazon products. I think pretty much everyone gets, and it's pretty transparent on Amazon, customers like you bought this. I mean, I think people get that that's going on. What would be different is if you were using that data for some really different purpose that was about training a system that Amazon might then go sell on, say, cloud services in some very other context. And I don't know that Amazon's doing that, but if they were doing that, that would concern me. But just using it in the context of, you know, sort of usual supply relationships, I'm basically fine with that. In terms of, you know, what is it that crosses that threshold when it moves from something we expect to something that's really a different part of the relationship? You know, look, that's really a contextual thing. It's not like a bright line that everything is or everything isn't. I mean, you even think about women's work in the household. For many years, that was like thought, oh, women just they love taking care of their kids, and you know, just and now we don't have that attitude anymore because of the social context changed, and it made that unacceptable. And as this becomes as AI becomes a large part of the GDP, I'm not worried about Amazon's optimizing e-commerce becoming a large part of GDP. I am worried about like a huge chunk of the GDP being like replaced by workers that are trained on these AI, you know, robot workers that are trained off of people's, you know, behavior. So I really think it's that social context that creates the appropriate framing of these different things.
I would actually go further.
Yeah.
I am actually concerned about some of those things, and I would say I give you a couple of examples. So you made the distinction between what the information that a brick and mortar store uses to change what it's selling versus an online platform. But think about a highly integrated brick and mortar store that uses intelligent machines to identify information about their consumers. I am concerned when a brick and mortar store puts a camera in a mannequin and spots you when you come in and uses facial recognition software to identify you, and then pops up on your phone a sale of like 20% for something based on the data that you've used from either that they've bought from a data broker or that you've used from a loyalty program or something like that. I am concerned, and that's quite different than a brick and mortar store responding to aggregate customers not buying a green sweater because of the very different ways in which that information is collected. So there are stories about, there are real situations like this where companies, literally will put a camera in the eye of a mannequin, which is the creepiest thing ever. And it will not just, the justification is that this camera is there for security purposes, and they're scanning your faces to compare it to an arrest database to see if you're gonna shoplift. But that creepiness aside, when that's used for consumer analysis, that puts me under surveillance the moment I come into an otherwise a quasi-public space, and that alters my behavior. Privacy is not just about the bad stuff that can happen when data gets out. It's about the social relationships given under surveillance. And I'm concerned about the existence of social relationships, or just our existence under surveillance by private companies.
A great example of that is that banks are increasingly thinking about putting in a camera to identify people coming in so they can the teller can greet them. And they have been trying to a large extent focus instead on, can you do it via CCTV cameras? Because everyone's okay with CCTV cameras, but they'd be really freaked out if there was a camera facing them coming in. That's a perfect example where the frictionless experience is exactly what we don't want. If people are going to be freaked out about a camera that's identifying them coming in and then the person greeting them, you shouldn't give them the impression that that's not happening, because clearly, there's a reason that they're freaked out about that. It's not like just doing it in a way that's hidden makes it less freaky to people. And the last thing I would say about the, kibbutzim, look, I agree with you that there were real problems with incentives in the kibbutzim. I think that's precisely the same problems that happen in the free online economy. It's not like that sort of market power that undermines incentives can only be created by, quote, the government, whatever that is. I mean, the kibbutzim weren't even the government. So the point is that market power can create that in all sorts of circumstances. And I think that's precisely what's being created within the within the Facebook, Google, and to some extent Bing space. And I think that's what we need to address, precisely for the reasons that you're saying, because we need to create incentives, not because we need to undermine them.
Tommaso. Mike. Sorry.
So this is super interesting. Thanks for doing this. This is important work. The question I had, since this is a conference kind of at the intersection of research and practice, is kind of about the traction that you've been able to get in practitioner circles. So for example, Ari, I'd be curious to hear kind of about your policy discussions and kind of what barriers that you've seen. And Glenn, I'd be curious to hear about that. But also kind of say at Microsoft, if there have been kind of efforts to take some of these ideas and put them into practice kind of on the business side.
I've gotten a lot of pushback from, I think I've gotten the same amount of pushback as I've gotten support from practitioners. And when I talk about practitioners, I'm talking about designers, so technology people, business persons, as well as lawyers in the field. And I think the key questions or problems they identify are they say something like, well, privacy by design is totally theoretical and that's not real, and how are you going to actually make that happen? Or, yeah, lawyers don't want to be, why would I want a lawyer involved in my design room? That's just going to get in the way, that's going to cause unnecessary friction, and regulation stifles innovation. Those things, excuse my language, are all bullshit, right? So the regulation does not stifle innovation. Regulation can direct innovation. The right regulation can inspire innovation. It's just kind of a mantra that people use. But those arguments aside, one of the things that I think people really get now is that design requires more of an attention to ethics and privacy. It's not just because of the GDPR, but it is significantly, but that's part of it. It's also because of the bad experiences that we are hearing from companies. It's from the bad experiences that they've had inside their own company. I talk a lot to people at various technology companies under confidentiality agreements, so I can't talk about specifics, but it's more that no one wants the bad thing, the bad consent decree, the bad this, the bad that to happen again. And the only way to do that is if we have a real strong FTC, if we have strong data protection authorities, they're going to make sure that that they're going to keep an eye on company behavior. And the way to make sure you don't run afoul of the FTC again is make sure that the lawyer has real say, or the privacy professional has real say in design. And CPOs love that. And executives that take this seriously love that. The executives what I found is the executives that have only given lip service to privacy their entire lives don't care, because they don't care to integrate privacy into their business ethos, because they don't see that privacy could actually be good for business. One of the things that I try to do, I've done some consulting work with companies about how to structure their internal systems and how to structure their privacy teams in order to make them more effective. And as soon as I do something like that, they realize, wow, this isn't actually so bad. I thought this was going to be a big speed bump or a hurdle to getting products out there. But in fact, this smooths out the process, because now I don't have to worry about the FTC coming after me afterwards. So I can save all this money at the end. And as soon as people realize that privacy by design is actually good for business.
On the Microsoft and policymaker side interactions I've had, I think that the relationship between the regulatory side, the public awareness side, the private, data labor union type, or you could call it consumer organization side, and the corporate response is incredibly symbiotic. Even if you have a leader of a tech company who really wants to make change, especially if that's a large organization and a complex organization, there's going to be a variety of stakeholders involved. And that person needs support from the press. They need support from regulators. They need support from public organization. And, public organization only happens when the press covers it. The press is only interested in when there's organizing going on. These things are very intertwined. And the usual model of in economics, which is like there's some technocrat, and the technocrat whispers in the ear of a prince, which is Al Roth's phrase, which I think is one of the worst things that economists ever, it's amazing how much market designers say that and like that idea, and how undemocratic that is. That's just not how things work or should work. It is a back and forth between all of these things, and it should be, because that's called democracy. So I don't view policymakers as my audience. I don't view organizers as my audience. I don't view the press as my audience. I view all of it's a democratic conversation that we all need to have. And those are moving along, and I can give you lots of concrete examples of incremental steps, but it's not like I'm just going and talking to some holder of power, and that holder of power is then just imposing things on everyone else. Because if that were the case, I wouldn't think I would have accomplished very much,
The benevolent social planner.
Yeah.
You had a question, Tomas?
Yes, I have a question. So,
that's the last one.
Okay.
And then we...
So many of the examples that both of you gave was Amazon and Facebook and so on, and then you came with this example of the seal, and then I was starting thinking, so the future will change. We will have Internet of Things, we will have the fridge talking to all the other things that we have in the house, so the data that will be collected will be more and more. So my question was, so how do you see privacy by design in such a very complex system? So you had the example with the Apple thing, or so with Snapchat. So, but it becomes even more difficult when you don't have an interface anymore like the computer, but it's your fridge, right? It's your oven, or it's so. Do you think that would be an even greater challenge, or actually is the same thing?
Yeah, I think the Internet of Things, which is this very summary phrase for a lot of different things, is an extraordinary privacy risk for 3 reasons. One, because we have this reflexive desire to make everything Wi-Fi enabled. There is a thing, by the way, if anyone is interested, there's this great Twitter account called Internet of Shit. I don't know if anyone follows it, but it is hilarious. And there are these stories, everyone is just, looking for it right now. But one example is we have Wi-Fi enabled underwear. And it exists. I'm not joking about this, and not just as a tool of romance, right? It's not just as a sex toy. It's meant to, which that can be. That's one thing. But Wi-Fi Wi-Fi enabled underwear to kind of like high-tech athletic wear. It lets you know when you're too sweaty or you need to hydrate or this or that, or if you're sick or something like that. We have to cut off at the knees this desire to Wi-Fi enable everything. We don't need Wi-Fi enabled underwear. Right? So that's part of the problem. If our desire, every day now, there's another product that you see advertised that doesn't need to be Wi-Fi enabled. That's one problem. The second problem is the interface problem, which means that we have to absolutely discard this notion of consent as the basis for our privacy protection. Because there is no way, there's no platform, there's no moment for us to consent. And the fact that there's no platform also means that it's a refrigerator, it's an espresso maker, it's not a website that you see as a company that's taking data. It is a device that is providing you with some benefit. It is my coffee maker, or it is my robot toy, or something like that. That all of these are Wi-Fi enabled, again, lulls you into this false sense of trust and security. And the third problem is they're far more manipulative. This is in a qualitatively different way than websites or website design can be manipulative, because these exist, they not just exist in physical space, but they have a social valence that websites do not. A website is just a series of ones and zeros on a computer screen. This is a dog. This is a seal. This is a thing that is involved in your life in ways that websites are not. As a result of those things, I think we need separate regulation when it comes to the Internet of Things. And I'm not sure that I'm not sure that we can exist in a privacy protective world, or at least in a world where we have options where we just let the Internet of Things just kind of bellow in a regulatory void. We need extraordinary regulatory friction there.
I don't think I'm quite as pessimistic as Ari is. The reason is that, look, we have all sorts of areas in our lives where we subject ourselves to a lot of control in some aspect, and we don't really think about it, and then we have certain key moments when we enter into negotiations. That's how most of our workplaces work. I'm not going around nickel and diming Microsoft and thinking about how I actually, I sort of try to do my job, and I'm an honest operator, and I do the right things with my receipts, and I try to do my work in the right way. But then I have a salary negotiation every couple of years, and we really agree to terms, and then we obey those for a while. And I think that if you really have something like a labor union where you really have a contract, it's monitoring all these things. You can adjust it when it's necessary. You have some time which is like, the time of the month when you go to look at your portfolio, where you really work out those terms. I think in a sound structure with real negotiations, I think that we can have a framework for this stuff. But I agree that if it just infects things, and if Google puts a thing that we don't even know is internet enabled up online and manipulates us into paying $46 for it so it can track our weight, that's not a really good trajectory for that. So I think it can go either way. But I think, look, we shouldn't get anti-technology or pro-regulation to just stop technology. That's not what we want. The role of regulation, it's to enable things to be productive. Look, the unions of the 19th century and early 20th century led to the 1940s through the 1970s, which are the highest productivity growth rate period ever in human history, at least within the wealthy countries. That is what we can aspire to. And it was because we rewarded the people who were doing the work that was creating that value. That's why those were the highest growing periods. And the idea that instead giving enormous rents to a bunch of people who just happened to create the social network that's like a way to spur social productivity, I think is crazy. This is pro-productivity. This is not anti-productivity.
That was a good final
That's a
word.
good end.
Thank you so much.
That was great.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ari.